great. So a huge welcome, Vidyamala and Jenny, to our community here. It's lovely to have you with us. I've had the privilege of working with both of you in various guises for a while. So it's a personal joy to have you with us here. And thank you so much for making time, because I also know how busy you are. I started writing a sort of introduction, and I kind of started running out of paper, if I'm honest, because your CVs and your achievements are just outstanding. But very briefly, for anybody who doesn't know you, Vidyamala has been practicing meditation for 35 years and is listed as one of the 100 most influential disabled people in the UK on the Shaw's Trust Power list, Power 100 list. And in 2020 was part of the My Year of Living Mindfully documentary. The way that I met Vidyamala was through Breathworks, and having started running mindfulness courses for people living with pain and illness in 2001, co-founded Breathworks in 2004, and that's one of the UK's leading mindfulness organisations, and with hundreds of teachers in over 35 countries, and in the spirit of full disclosure, of which I am one. I'm very grateful for it. And developed mindfulness for health, as well as mindfulness for stress, and is an author of many books, including Mindfulness for Health and Mindfulness for Women, and also an international speaker. And I also happen to know, Vidyamala, although this wasn't published anywhere, that one of your absolute passions is the Breathworks Foundation, making mindfulness training available for people who, for whatever reason, aren't able to fund it themselves. And I know that to be a wonderful, wonderful piece of work that you do. And Jenny Edwards, CBE, is Mindfulness Initiative Health Lead for the Mindfulness Initiative. So we kind of know each other through working on different work strands for the Mindfulness Initiative. And just such a long list of chief executives. I didn't really know where to start. Founding member of the Society of Leadership Fellows, the Windsor Society, chief executive of the Mental Health Foundation, chief executive of Homeless Link, director of external relations of the Arts Council, and I literally could go on. But I'm conscious that everybody would probably like to hear you speak rather than hear me whittering on about your accolades. But marvelous and such rich careers, and there's a common theme in both of them, which was very noticeable as I was doing the research, was just that they're all about helping people. They're all about helping people and creativity as well. So with that in mind, we had a chance to meet before to look at how could we provide some structure around this conversation. And we thought we would start by really, well, actually, is there anything I've missed before we go into the questions, Vidyamala and Jenny? Okay. So
actually,
Jenny,
sorry, can I just say one thing,
yes,
Andrew, quickly, which is because I've got a constant back pain, and what works for me is to stand up every 20 minutes. So I've got a timer on my watch, and I've got a desk that goes up and down. So I'm just going to stand up in the middle of the session, and it will look like I'm levitating, which is exciting, but actually my desk is just going up. And I always encourage other people to also look after your needs during the next hour and a half. We're not designed as human beings to be slumped in front of computers for hours at a time. So when I move, if you think, gosh, I'd really like to stand up or have a walk about or whatever, please do so. Jenny and I are not going to worry at all if we see people wandering around your rooms whilst we're speaking. And for myself, I'll just feel really glad that you're doing what you need. And it is related to the topic, because people with long COVID are having to learn how to pace their activities. So I'm also modeling something. Yeah, so I just wanted to let you know why I'm going to suddenly levitate in 15 minutes.
Thank you, Vidyamala. That was a skill that I didn't actually mention that you had, so levitation. So thank you, and a great reminder. Yes, please, let's all be comfortable. So Jenny, can we start with a question to you, please? Can you sort of explore what for you is coming out of the data about the consequences, the impact of COVID. And the reason why Jenny's particularly well placed for this is that Jenny very kindly sort of coordinated the Mindfulness Initiative response right at the start of the pandemic, and has been watching this very closely and has a long career in health. So Jenny, what are your thoughts on that?
I think the first thing is to reflect on the fact that probably for everyone in this room and everyone we know, this has been an extraordinary period and one like no other. And while there will be things that many of us will take from it, which actually turn out to be positive in the long run, I think that at this point we have to reflect on the difficulties that have been experienced in so many ways, which do come out of the sort of burgeoning research projects now. But the first of all is the extent of the loss that we've had of our family, friends, neighbours, community, the talents, the love that we would have had of people who've been lost. And Teresa has got some slides from me, which she's going to show, which are there for people to use sort of in the long run if you want to reflect on some of these things. The global loss from deaths is 2.9 million so far, which is undoubtedly an underestimate. And the UK loss is, depending on how you count it, between 127,000 and 150,000. And of course, all of those people will have others who care about them, and it's impacted on them. And even the nature of bereavement has been different over this period, where people perhaps have not been with their life companion or people that they love, or have not been able to mourn in the same way, or it's been more of a shock, or a colleague when we return to the workplace, however we do that, may not be at their desk. So I think we have to not pass over that loss too quickly. And then if you could move on to the next one, Teresa. This is the other people who've been very, very much profoundly affected, the people who've actually been hospitalised over this period. And we will go on to talk more about long COVID, which is much more frequent from people who've been in hospital, though not only them, and sometimes for very long periods. So thank you. Can you move on to the next one? We also know, and this is coming out of more and more research, that the impact that we've been experiencing isn't evenly distributed. I'm sure we've seen the headlines. I've put some of them here, that particular ethnic minorities have been more at risk of death for various reasons, partly by the nature of their place in the workplace, or overcrowded housing, and poverty. Though that Sheffield study is interesting and now showing that actually people who are working and poor have been hardest hit by the pandemic, even more than people who are out of work, which is not always the case. And people with disabilities, whether they're ongoing conditions like diabetes, cancer treatment, cardiovascular disease, or learning disabilities, people with Down syndromes have extremely high risk. So, and some of those, of course, are not going to be necessarily very visible in the workplace if we start thinking about the workplace. I thought the graph that came out of Independent Sage that's there just showing the difference in admissions to ICU is quite interesting. So if you could go to the next one, Teresa. Thank you. Yes, that's just a summary actually of those that have been particularly hit. Those in health and social care, of course, have really been on the front line and experiencing the sort of stresses that they didn't expect to see necessarily in their career, or certainly not at that level of intensity. And the next slide. Yes, let's move on a bit to the impact on our health and well-being. There are losses that people have had and changes that we know long-term do have an effect on our mental health, particularly like losing your job, because you don't only become more financially insecure, certainly in the short term, but you lose the connections that you've had through work, and also the relationships and your sense of self, which is often bound up in the work that we do. So those who have either lost work or have felt insecure, perhaps because they've been furloughed or weren't sure if they'd have a job when at the end of the pandemic, whatever we count the end as being, that we know has quite profound effects on us and our sense of who we are and our well-being. Other aspects of health that we might not have felt are connected, of course, have been affected, because normal preventative services, checkups, treatment, the speed at which you're likely to get treatment, your concerns about going into healthcare settings have all been very much disruptive, and those have knock-on effects as well. There's now a lot of research emerging about mental health. Not all, some of it's contradictory, and there are some differences between the first wave of the pandemic and later ones, but obviously the first wave has been more researched. But what's clear is that there has been stress really for everybody. That sort of mishmash of colours at the bottom is stress over time. It comes from the most recent government report. It does show some sort of leaps, which you know, will repay some more looking at. But particularly recently, one of the biggest leaps is for people earning less than £16,000 a year. So again, it's people who are the sort of working poor who round about January this year have had a big leap in their stresses. Perhaps we could speculate they're coming to the end of all the strategies that they've had to try and cope with this period of having much less money, and perhaps feeling that it was going to come to an end, but then we had another lockdown. Anyway, that's going to take longer to establish. I think I might stop this section there. That's probably enough facts for now, Andrew, and pass back to you.
Thank you. It's amazing to see that data put together so clearly. And thank you for being willing to share that and make that a resource for the community. It's really appreciated. Vidyamala, can you explain how you think mindfulness can help offer some kind of a solution or help in all this?
Well, I think mindfulness can help enormously in all this, because mindfulness gives us mental and emotional resources to deal with whatever arrives in our lap in life. That's a general point. And of course, what's happened is we've had a global pandemic arrive in our lap over the last year. And as Jenny was saying, none of us have lived through anything like this in our lifetime. And in a way, one of the things that mindfulness, or the philosophy underlying mindfulness, is saying that life is uncertain all the time, actually. You know, one of the things that mindfulness is telling us, if we go deeper and deeper into our experience, we realize that everything's changing, everything's flowing, that this body that can seem so solid is in fact a whole load of processes. Our emotions likewise, our thoughts likewise, everything is fluid and changing, the world around us. But normally what we're doing is we're trying to fix things because we like stability as human beings. That's something that gives us a sense of security. But if we go very deeply into our mindfulness practice, we're learning how to live with a more fluid and open experience all the time, which means we're also learning how to live with uncertainty. And, you know, as mindfulness practitioners, when the pandemic came along, of course, a lot of us were also thrown by that, of course. My time is going off telling me I need to stand up, which I shall do in a moment. But really, I remember talking to my friends and thinking we shouldn't be surprised. This is what we've been training for. We've been training for when something comes along that we can't control, that's way beyond our control, and where we're not getting things on our own terms, and we're having to be thrown back to our own resources, physically, mentally, and emotionally. So I think mindfulness builds resilience. Definitely. You can chunk your life down to one moment at a time. You know, when you're catastrophizing about the future, you just draw everything back into the present. And the present is, in my own experience, much more bearable than perhaps we expect it to be. And that's my own experience living with pain for a long time. If I think about the ideas of the pain and the future of pain and the past of pain, that's overwhelming. But when I just come back to just this moment and this one and this one and this one, then it's not only bearable, but of course we open up to all the other dimensions of the moment. There's always pleasure in the moment and beauty in the moment if we're allowing ourselves to kind of land in the present. So I think mindfulness is in a certain kind of way the ultimate resource for times like this. It's free. It's always available. We don't need any equipment. We've always got our minds. And something I was writing something the other day about how, you know, the truth is that your mind can wreck your life or your mind can enrich your life. And that will depend on the quality of your mind and how trained your mind is, how much you have trained your mind to be able to draw back to the present, rest and flow, be stable in the face of whatever comes in. You have this kind of sense of ballast and equanimity. So I think generally speaking, mindfulness can offer a huge solution. And what we've got to remember is that this pandemic is not over. It's not like Jenny and I are speaking to you today and it's like, well, 2020 is over, thank goodness. And now normal service has resumed, which is perhaps what many of us might have thought a year ago. But, you know, we're living in a changed world. We've got the threat of variants, which I'm not a scientist, but on my reading of it is a very serious threat. We've got this lockdown easing happening, but it's tentative. A lot of the people I respect are saying we're going to have to be having some sort of social distancing for a long time. Our work patterns, I think, will have changed forever. So all the people here, mindfulness in the workplace, you're going to be adjusting to some of your team, if not all of your team, working from home some of the time, if not all of the time. I doubt we're going to go back to these great commutes and to crowded office spaces anytime soon. So the training on living with uncertainty goes on and on and on. And in a way, as I've said, that's a training for life. And the pandemic has just really heightened that. So I think mindfulness does resource us for living in an unstable world, because the world is unstable and the world was unstable. It's just that maybe we hadn't quite realized that to the extent that we have now. Yeah.
Thank you. It struck me as you were speaking, Vidyamala, that and this kind of speaks to the next question, I think, a bit, is around the sort of shattering of the delusion of control. That certainly for me personally, part of my journey to discover mindfulness was suddenly realizing that I didn't have the level of control that I thought I had over my life, and had to find a mechanism by which I could navigate that. And it's kind of like the whole world's discovered that overnight, or a large chunk of it. And that's quite an interesting conundrum, because individually perhaps we could find our paths through that, but doing that collectively as a society or as a species is quite a thing.
And I think, yeah, and I think it's interesting because one might think that one meditates and learns mindfulness to have more control over your mind. Yeah, so I'm meditating so I can be in control. That might be what you're thinking, but we need to be very clear, well, what is it that we're in control of? We can't control the circumstances. We can never control the circumstances completely in our lives. You know, we might get ill tomorrow. There might be a global financial crisis and all of our money goes. We know that. We've had these recurring financial crises. Now we've got a major health crisis. But we can have, I don't think control is quite the right word, but we can have a powerful sense of initiative in relation to how we respond to things, because mindfulness gives us choice. So rather than being a victim and thinking, oh my God, it's all terrible and I can't do anything, I'm powerless, which we could perhaps think at the moment, quite understandably. Mindfulness and mind training is saying, yes, there's all these things happening outside of you that you can't control, but you can always choose what mental attitude you bring to the experience that arrives in the moment. So mindfulness does give you this powerful sense of initiative and agency, but it's within this, you have to know what is it that you're getting agency over. You're not going to get agency over the pandemic, but you can get agency over how you respond to the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So Jenny, just building on that, could you explore a little bit about how you think that mindfulness might work then, in terms of how it might be applied, or how you think that we might use it to address some of the challenges that we're now facing?
Well, it's interesting. There was a report from the government on sort of mental health during the pandemic. It's updated quite regularly, and I was noticing that it described how there were different groups of types of response psychologically to what we were experiencing. And there were some that were related to actually an outcome that was worsening mental health. One of the groups at other times would probably do quite well. There are people who like to make a plan and to tackle a problem and to know what to do. And I think that relates to what Vidyamala was saying, that you can't control the pandemic, and here people who like to think, well, I'm going to sort that one out. I've got the fix to that, and that didn't work in these circumstances. And then there's the group of responses that I'm sure we've all get tempted to sometimes, which are called the sort of avoidant responses, which include, turning to the bottle or other forms of, self denial of what's going on, or people saying this isn't really serious, and that definitely wasn't good for people's health. And then the other one that I'm just looking at the title is called supportive coping, which again is often quite a good one. It's like, find somebody that you trust to talk with if you've got problems. It's often stronger in women because they tend to have stronger social networks, and they suffered particularly at the start of the first lockdown more than men. And that also didn't particularly work during the lockdown phase, but it did work when people were starting to come out of it. So that it's a reaching out. People perhaps didn't have their normal social connections to go to. But the group that did do well is in a group called emotion-focused coping. Actually do relate to what Vidyamala was saying, because one of the big features of that was acceptance, and just thinking, we are here. This is what we're living in at the moment. How can I reframe that in a way that's positive? So I just take myself, somebody I locked myself down a bit earlier. I've been living on my own with my cat all this time. Finally had some people in my garden at Easter weekend. But what I took, and I think this it's helped that I've been connected with people in the mindfulness sphere, was first of all that it was giving me time to just say, well, I don't have to bother myself with lots of things that I did in the past, and I'm going to make sure that I walk in nature every day, and that's given me more and more every day. But I could have taken it as, this is awful, I'm really isolated, I'm not seeing anybody, I haven't had a hug for a year, I haven't seen my son for more than 18 months now, but it doesn't change anything apart from how you see, what you tell yourself about what you're experiencing. So I sort of lost the question a bit, but I think the evidence is that whatever technique you find, and some people will use prayer, some people use meditation, some people use yoga or mindful photography, some have been doing. you can find different ways of approaching the strengths in yourself, perhaps that you did, the paths that you didn't have before, and that those are there for you to tap into now, but potentially in the future as well. And it's easy to say, it's much harder to do if your mind is being drawn in the direction of the losses that you felt, but that's where mindfulness techniques come in. And of course they have been over time used in so many health related areas and more general areas for our well-being, and there's stacks of evidence around it. If people want more of that, there's in the Mindfulness Initiative, there's one of the papers is about mental health and well-being, and it lists some of the areas. But we need to find ways that work for us individually, that help us be resilient and as positive as we can be in reframing the experience that we're going through at a time that we can't stop that experience happening to us.
Thank you. Yeah, and I absolutely, and I think that's this wonderful community has sort of people exploring mindfulness in various different sort of ways and forms, and we always try to come back to the evidence as well. We try to look for the evidence, and it's fascinating to hear that sort of comparative approach, that the emotion focused group were the most able to navigate this, and that point about acceptance, again coming back to perhaps the delusion of control and accepting this is what's happening. Absolutely fascinating. Vidyamala, I know that you've been doing a lot of work during this time around health and practice. Can I ask you to share some of the outcomes that you've seen, some of the things that you've noticed or witnessed?
Sorry, I just flicked to another screen by accident. Well, I thought I'd take this opportunity to talk a little bit about long COVID, because I think that's going to have an impact on the workplace. I mean, my suspicion is that in 5-10 years' time, that's going to be one of the biggest long-term impacts of this whole pandemic. Like, the pandemic will eventually pass, but there's going to be a lot of people who are left with compromised health. And I'm just wondering whether we should show Jenny's slide with the stats on that, because that's really a useful slide. So perhaps, Teresa, you could share that.
There's a headline that says 1 million people plus are affected have been affected in February, which is the last set of statistics. And then slide 9 says who gets it and what are the symptoms.
Okay, Jenny, say that again. Is that
Let's go to slide 9. Yeah.
Which one? Slide 9.
That's it. Stop there. Yeah. So this is, I mean, these are staggering, these statistics. So more than 1 million affected in February. And this is an ONS survey, which is quite interesting. It's a very big survey. So this is in the month of February, there were more than 1 million affected. 1 in 5 have symptoms of COVID 5 weeks after the initial infection. 1 in 5, that's 20%. 1 in 7 after 12 weeks. And 1 in 5 said their symptoms limited their day-to-day activities a lot. Yeah, so this is a very substantial impact that we're seeing from COVID on people's long-term health. Okay, so you could go out of that now, Teresa, if you want. So I think, you know, as workplaces, it's going to be something that employers and colleagues, you know, how do we support people who have these long-term symptoms of COVID? And the most common symptoms are anxiety, brain fog, fatigue, and breathlessness. Yeah, there's lots and lots of symptoms, but those are seen to be the most impactful. We've been doing some work with UCL, the eHealth unit at UCL. So this is what they're finding. interestingly, and apparently this is quite controversial, that the fatigue is more like MS fatigue than chronic fatigue. So that's very, very interesting. It shows it's possibly a kind of neurological disorder. Nobody really knows. It's also new. People with long COVID are feeling quite abandoned on the whole because there's so little support at the moment. It's such a new disease and the numbers are so great. So the reason I wanted to bring this in, because you're all part of a workplace group and you may well have colleagues already, or you will have colleagues who have long COVID. And I think we really need to be kind and really support these people and help them stay in meaningful work, whilst also recognizing that their ability to work in the old way is going to be affected. And partly why I'm so passionate about this is because I've had to find ways to work with my own disability. And being in work, there's, as you all know, there's tons of evidence that being in work is really good for your mental health. So just casting people onto the scrap heap because you've got long COVID, or it might even be some mental health problem from the COVID pandemic, that's awful. So, and as Jenny's already said, the mental health impact is huge. So again, coming out of the pandemic, we're going to have a population with poorer mental health and this big cohort with poorer physical health. We've been doing work with an IAPT service in Sheffield. Let me just get my notes. Since 2018, running the Breathworks mindfulness-based pain management program there. And our program has been developed specifically for people with health conditions. Yeah, so there are certain adaptations. Again, I thought I just mentioned some of those because this will be relevant if you're teaching mindfulness to your colleagues at work or in the workplace. And people with health conditions and long COVID, they're going to need to have adaptations. Yeah. So we've been doing this work in Sheffield in the IAPT service, 10 courses a year, reaching 100 to 120 people a year. Interestingly, with people with long-term conditions, a 60% reduction in fatigue, an 80% reduction in pain with people with IBS, and a 90% reduction in pain severity. So we know that mindfulness can be effective for people with long-term health conditions. And it's a powerful intervention because it's group-based, so it can be relatively cheap, doesn't need lots of high-tech scanners and so on. And it can be effectively delivered online. We've moved all of our stuff online in the last year and have been staggered at how effective online mindfulness can be. In some ways, we realized this some years ago when we started doing online courses, in some ways it can be more effective because people can have contact every day with their cohort. Whereas if you go to a class once a week, you're only seeing people once a week. The recovery rate target of the IAPT service for people with anxiety and low mood is 50%. They want 50% of the people to move below the threshold of clinical concern for anxiety and low mood. So that's what they're looking at. Half the people who go through any of their programs, and they've got anxiety programs, CBT and so on, you want half to have an impact on anxiety and low mood. And what we're finding with the Breathworks program is it's 54%, which is a very good outcome, especially because the people there have not only got anxiety and low mood, but they've also got underlying physical health conditions. Just said a little bit about long COVID because we've been doing quite a lot of development work around this and dialoguing with the eHealth team at UCL, as well as patient support groups. And this is another very interesting thing about long COVID, that it's a new illness in the era of patient support groups. So all the sort of policymakers really have to listen to the patients. It's probably never quite happened before. We probably never had something new come into the health arena when you've got people can set up a Facebook group that's got 40,000 people in it in the UK. There's I think it's about 40,000, the long COVID support group. And we've also got a health service design now that has PPS, which you'll know what that means, Jenny, patient partnership. Is that right?
Yes, anyway, it's participation. Basically.
Patient participation, that's it.
Yeah.
So when you're developing health interventions now, it's seen as good practice to listen to the patients. So very interesting. We've talked to another guy in Wales who's very active in the long COVID support in Wales, who's an opera singer, interestingly, who's been struck down by long COVID. So as I've said, the most common symptoms are anxiety, brain fog, fatigue, and breathlessness. And what David Lee Bowen, this guy in Wales, was saying in terms of mindfulness is that people are working with a new and unfamiliar experience of fatigue. So we need to know that if we're teaching mindfulness, that the fatigue is not just being a bit tired, it's being absolutely shattered. So he was saying in support groups, if people are reporting when they go to standard meditation classes where there isn't specific guidance, they can feel guilty about needing to lie down to meditate. So we need to be very permissive in our language around posture, because it's just, people can't sit up, some of them, they're just too exhausted. You also, it's helpful to say, if you go to sleep, that's fine, because a lot of people will go to sleep in the meditation. And again, they can feel really guilty when they're in a normal meditation class that they need to lie down and that they're going to sleep. And he reported that people often feel dismissed in standard generic classes. So I thought that was very interesting. And at Breathworks, permissiveness is really central to our approach. So giving people permission to adopt whatever posture is going to work to meditate. If you need to move during the meditation because of pain or fatigue, then yes, it's absolutely fine to move. You need to state these things. You can't assume that people will know that, because a lot of us, we want to be good and to fit in. So you need to really state it. We use short meditations, 10-minute meditations. 40 minutes is way too long sometimes if people are ill and exhausted. So I think in terms of the people in this group being mindfulness teachers, you can't assume a one-size-fits-all approach is going to work with people with long COVID. So going back to what David Lee Bowen was saying, there's the fatigue. He said that people are working with uncertainty in the face of the unknown trajectory of the disease. Yeah, imagine how awful that is. You know, you've got these symptoms, maybe you've had them for a year, and there's a lot of people now who've had them for a year, and nobody knows anything about what the future holds with your health. So again, the skills we were talking about before about giving people the ability to manage uncertainty, hugely important. Helping people learn to work with catastrophizing, really common, of course. You know, my life is ruined, it's all terrible. My future is going to be terrible. So just giving people the skills to keep coming back to their direct experience in the moment. Breathing is very interesting, because a lot of meditations that we do in mindfulness are breath-based. And if you're breathless, that can be very triggering. And people here might be interested in looking at the trauma-informed mindfulness, which encourages us to use different anchors. I often just say to people, if your breath is provoking anxiety, just come into the sensations of contact with the chair and the floor, something that's stable. But then again, you don't want to scare people off the breath. That's something that David was saying. If you communicate anxiety as the teacher, mustn't go near the breath, then that will also be picked up on. So generally, I will encourage people to work with breathing, but then say, if that's triggering for you, then go to another anchor. Another thing I do at Breathworks is I teach the physiology of breathing, because often we, as meditation teachers, we encourage people to work on breathing, but we don't give them any help on how to breathe more optimally. So I've known people who've meditated for decades on poor breathing. And so I think, well, that's a shame. You could actually have spent all those years meditating on kind of health-giving breathing. So I do some work around that, generally speaking, the physiology of breathing. Helping people to build their confidence. You know, you are tolerating the present moment. That's a skill. You can feel confident that you can do that, because people's confidence is absolutely shattered. Of course, you've lost so much. Sometimes whole families are struck down. It's not just you, it might be, you know, parents and children all struck down by long COVID. Imagine that, you know, the financial impact and so on. And then movement is a very controversial area. It's been a controversial area in chronic fatigue management for years. There's been something called graded exercise, which has been taken out of the NICE guidelines now, I think. But he said that a lot of people are being, the long COVID physios are directing people to mindful movement, which is quite interesting. Yeah, where less is more, and helping people listen and fine tune their awareness of the body, rather than going to a yoga class or necessarily trying to move more. Because some people haven't moved hardly at all for months. So it's very, very gentle. And then pacing is obviously a huge aspect of any kind of long-term condition management. And I'm demonstrating that by standing up. That's me pacing my sitting. So what I might just very briefly do, I'm just going to share some slides about how you can bring pacing into your workplace and your mindfulness programs. I'm aware of time, but I'll just drop this in quickly. Now what's happened? Where's it gone? Here it is. I've got the doom of death going round. PowerPoint not responding. Okay, I'm not going to do that after all. I'll just talk you through it. Basically, it's about activity management. And this is hugely important for people with fatigue issues. Generally, what we do as humans is we'll push ourselves until we can't do something anymore. You probably all recognize that in your own behavior. Working at your computer, say, you know, we'll work and work and work until we're so exhausted that we can't do it anymore. That really doesn't work if you've got a fatigue issue. You can kind of get away with it if you're healthy, but if you've got a long-term health condition, you absolutely need to learn how to manage your activities. So a little slogan is take a break before you break, or take a break before you need it. And simply using a timer can be a very good way of doing that. So if you've got people in the workplace, they could just, it might be 5 minutes, 10 minutes at the computer, and then to have a break and then keep coming back. And speaking personally, I always quite enjoy saying this, that learning to manage my activities has been much more life-changing for me than meditation. So learning to pace how I work on my computer means that I can do a full day's work and then come to a seminar in the evening, rather than wiping myself out in the morning and then that's me done for the day. So I think in the workplace, it's really important that those of us who are managers or colleagues with people with long COVID and mindfulness teachers, that we help people learn how to manage their work sustainably. Another little slogan is, when in doubt, breathe out. Because what most of us do most of the time is hold our breath. So we have any kind of stressor and we hold the breath. So simply learning how to exhale and release into gravity. So just drop down into the moment, into the body, let the out breath go all the way out, then the in breath flow in its own time. That will be helpful. And that will be really helpful for people with breathlessness as well. Because when you're breathless, you tend to, panic around the breath and hold the breath. It's just releasing and living with gravity. That's another real skill, because if you really release the weight of the body down onto the chair into gravity, then your breathing will quite naturally settle. So you're not forcing the out breath, but there's just this quality of release. So yeah, I really wanted to give some practical tips about long COVID, because I think it will come into our workplaces if it's not there already. So yeah, maybe that's all I'll say now, because I'm aware of time, Andrew.
Thank you, Vidyamala. There's so much there, and if we can grab those slides, then we'll make them available to people afterwards. Just so much. And one of the things which there's a theme for me about what you're both sharing, which is just the sheer scale of this, which may sound a bit ridiculous because we've been having it on the news all the time and we see the numbers and the daily count and we know that it's big. But actually, when you think about 1/60th roughly of the population is suffering from long COVID, that's huge. And that means that most of us, I guess, will bump up against people who are suffering from long COVID in our personal and our business lives. And the other thing which you touched on right at the start was, as we come blinking out of our COVID bunkers, if that's what happens over the next few weeks and months, we will see the absence of people. And I shared with you both when we were preparing for this, I had the privilege of attending a nice committee looking at doing some research work for a big consultation on mental health in the workplace, which is due to be published, I think, next year. And they had a psychologist there talking about trauma and saying that there were two types of trauma. There was a standard trauma, if you like, where we suffer something which is very dramatic, we're attacked, or there's a car accident or something, and some of us survive for a bit and then fall off a cliff. There's another type of trauma, which is incremental trauma, which is little things which chip away at us, and eventually some of us fall off a cliff. And it's interesting, I've spoken to a few people in the workplace recently who've talked about members of their team who've had psychotic episodes, and I don't remember ever coming across that myself. I know that it happens, and I know that it has happened, and I know of people to whom it has happened, but hearing it so directly, so quickly, such a short pace of time, I think is really concerning and something that we need to be aware of. So not only do we have the scale of long COVID and the impact of that, but we have this traumatic event which has happened to so many of us. Then even if none of that's happened to us, we've all had this sudden realization of the delusion of control being taken away from us. That's quite a lot to navigate, isn't it? It's quite a lot to navigate. And for the people in this room, there's a real role to play, I think, from everything that you both shared around our capacity to navigate that with compassion and acceptance, and also some very practical tips on how we can navigate with, or help people navigate with, long COVID. We can be really helpful in this challenging time. Is there anything that you'd like to add before we go to questions? Because I am conscious that we've been asking a lot for you to talk for this length of time, and I also want to give our community some time to come in. But if there's any sort of thoughts before we go to questions, do let me know.
I just wanted to show one or two things on the other slides.
Yes, please.
Teresa could show slide 9.
We'll give it a go. I think all our PowerPoints seem to be playing up today.
Don't worry, I can say what the key point is, and it will be there for people to pick up after.
No, should be getting there right now, possibly.
Yeah, slide 9. The next one, yeah. Just because we've tended to hear a lot about COVID being sort of so related to age and the older age groups, I just wanted to draw your attention to that statistic around age 25 to 34. The people who are reporting symptoms at 12 weeks, it's the 25 to 34 group that actually at the moment, according to the ONS, have got the highest number of reports. So let's just a reminder not to think that COVID is only related to later life, that it will be coming up there in the normal working age sort of workforce in different ways. And then the next slide was just the effects on daily life that people find from long COVID. Remembering things like childcare, a lot of the extra pressures that people have been reporting over this period. And one of the reasons why women's mental health seems to have suffered more is both the sort of domestic chores, as it's called here, but also homeschooling and trying to work as well, that people have had, that sometimes this sort of triple whammy, and women are more likely to have insecure work or be in frontline work and to be in lower paid work. All of that together has had a particular impact. I think those are the main things. Let me just check. No, the rest was on what mindfulness approaches might be useful for, which I think Vidyamala's covered very well. There are some opportunities coming up in the future to put your thoughts into government. People may have noticed that right at the end of March, there's a new paper that's come out on mental health and well-being. And this is a sort of short-term plan really for the next year, but looking for input in the longer term. And there's a section that is on the workplace and mental health, and also prevention and mental health. Employers in September are going to be asked to sign up to something called the Prevention Concord Act, which I have to say my old organisation was partly involved in sort of calling for that, getting support for people's mental health and thinking about mental health in a sort of constructive way much earlier, not just getting treatment for when people are ill, which is obviously very important, but how do we support people's mental health in the long run? How do we help people find the right way to become resilient, not by being determined to be as strong as possible, but by finding the strategies that work for them? So that will be coming out in the autumn. And there's also a new way of handling sort of public health issues on mental health, which is going to be part of this Office of Health Promotion based inside the Department of Health, which got to find out how that works. But a part of that, and what's always regarded as a really important aspect of the public health and mental health, is mental health in the workplace. So I think if you've got interesting work and interesting ideas and things that you want to report on, or suggestions for what you think should happen to support employers in their work on mental health, and potentially working with their supply chains as well, because we know the gig economy has been one aspect of real pressures on people, then there will be opportunities that are coming up where they don't have the answers yet. They are going to be looking for good ideas. I think that's a good point at which to pass back to you and participants.
I'm just wondering if you could put a link for that in the chat box, Jenny.
I'll find it. Well,
yeah, so people can contribute to that. It sounds important. And I just, well, one thing to say, which is really agreeing with you, Andrew, that we mustn't underestimate the impact that we could have as mindfulness practitioners and humans in the workplace. And when I talk about mindfulness, I always include kindness. Always include kindness. Just having kind people in the workplace can make a huge difference. Having kind, aware people who are committed to training the mind and the heart. The world needs that more than ever.
Thank you both so much. I'm so sorely tempted just to continue the conversation, but I'm going to try and be disciplined, because there are already some brilliant questions coming in, which I really do want to open it up. I would be grateful, Jenny, if you could perhaps point us in the direction of that link, and I'd also point people in the direction of NICE and the consultation which is going on there as well, because I think you hit the nail on the head. I don't think anybody knows the answers, and so people are really crying out for the answers, and we hold them. And as we hold not all the answers, but we hold something that can help a bit, and probably a lot more than just a bit. And as Vidyamala said, you know, and as you both know, this group is made up of trainers and champions, so people who are just advocates for mindfulness in the workplace, and so are brilliantly well placed to actually empower people through this knowledge. And make people feel that it's okay to explore this knowledge as well. So let me, you see, I nearly did anyway. I nearly just carried on the conversation. So I'm going to be good. Can I invite, is it Parveen who asked the first question? I'm struggling because I can't get my chat function to go back up.
Yes, it is.
Parveen, would you like to ask your question of the panel?
Yes, thank you. As you were saying, that the working poor have been most strongly affected. A study is showing that has been most strongly affected by the pandemic. Although mindfulness has become a lot more accessible, I think, over the past few years, but still sometimes it can be perceived as this middle class kind of treatment or intervention. How do you think mindfulness could be made more accessible to groups who are marginalized?
I think,
Jenny, just before you answer that, can I just pick up a note from Vidyamala and invite everybody just to stretch or move, because we have been sat in a spot for a bit, and it's a brilliant question, but I thought I'd learn. Thank you. And don't feel you have to stop. Brilliant. Jenny, I think you were just on the cusp of answering.
This is an issue really close to my heart, because having worked in fields like homelessness in the past, I've often felt that the people who have the greatest need for support for their mental health often have the least access from in all sorts of ways. And in fact, I remember a really good session with Groundwork, who work with, it's an organisation of homeless people, where somebody was speaking about how valuable they'd found mindfulness, but of course it's rarely on offer. It's one of the positive things, I think, that has come out of the pandemic, that this suddenly has led to so much wonderful material being available online. And I'm going to find the link in a moment to the resources that the Mindfulness Initiative put out at the start of the pandemic. So many great teachers brought their work online, as Vidyamala was saying, and the Oxford Mindfulness Centre. And it's been, I know, you know, we do have digital exclusion as well, but also many people do have phones that will access certainly the audio of recordings. And in some parts of the country, as I know in London, it's all available free to people who are residents in that area. So part of the struggle over recent years has been to try and get the NHS to provide mindfulness where people feel that it will help them, because then it is available to all, and particularly if it's recommended by their GP, people will give it a try. But it's been very difficult to change rather fixed mindsets, despite the very strong evidence that now exists. So I think the digital approach is helping. But that's not the only thing. It's also important that the way classes are taught or experience is sort of brought to bear on what people may need comes from leadership in the relevant communities, whether it's by language or by experience. I think more and more that is coming out now. There is a mindfulness network for people of colour that's been growing very rapidly in the last 12 months. There's a network for social change and mindfulness, which brings some of this work together. So I think you know, more people are taking it into the communities that they come from, that they feel they can adapt the sort of more standard approach to, and deliver something that is valuable. And it'd be really interesting to see where all of that goes.
Thank you.
Could I just add something? I know we've got other questions, but it's been interesting doing this work on long COVID with UCL and their e-health team. And you do it for a reading age of 12, which is very interesting because most mindfulness stuff is for a much higher reading age, but that's the target audience, as it were. You can't make it digitally sophisticated because, as Jenny was saying, there's digital exclusion. Some people don't even have SIM contracts. They're paying for data, you know, by just downloading. And that could be, say, if you got your kids at home doing their schoolwork on your mobile phone, it can cost £100 a day. So it's this kind of thing that you can't assume. So it's just really, really basic, leaflet based. But it's really exciting. They want to have mindfulness in their resources, re-languaged in this kind of way. So I've done some scripts, and then one of their team is rewriting all those scripts to make them language appropriate or age appropriate, as it were, literacy appropriate. I think we need much more diversity in the mindfulness scene, obviously, because if you only see white teachers and you only see white people in a class and you're from another community, it's not going to be very appealing necessarily. So Breathworks has partnered with the Mindfulness Network of People of Colour, and we've got an internship now to try to have more people of colour teachers. We've got an adaptive program called Take Back Your Life, which is for people where English isn't the first language, and that's been rolled out on Tower Hamlets. So I think there needs to be this quite active, innovative work if we're going to see the mindfulness scene change in all the ways that both Jenny and I have said.
Thank you. And just a plug, as part of our Festival of Inclusion, Dean and Aisha, who are joining us this evening, are very kindly agreed to participate in a seminar in a few weeks' time, and we're looking forward to hearing that. Because we've discussed as a community exactly this theme of accessibility and so forth. Actually, Dean and Aisha, I don't want to put you on the spot, but did you have any thoughts on that theme? Feel free to say no. No.
Yeah, I guess there's so many things that both Jenny and Vidyamala have mentioned that, you know, are really important to address, I think. But I think definitely looking at the curriculums. In fact, one of the points that came up was sort of this idea of one size fits all definitely won't be appropriate for long COVID. But I think there is also an assumption that maybe even the standard program is a one size fits all. And, you know, there's been mentions about the trauma sensitive work, and we've done some of that work ourselves. And I think there's what's really important is to assume that somebody, at least somebody in the group that we might be teaching or working with, are experiencing or have experienced some form of trauma, accumulative trauma, as Andrew mentioned as well, and really acknowledging some of the things that have been said, the diversity of teachers, the diversity of the material. I think that, you know, simplifying the curriculum and making it a reading age, you know, making that very explicit can also be challenging, because some people might think, hang on a minute, I mean, you know, I am able to read, and I am able, so doing that specifically for certain groups could also be problematic as well as beneficial. So it's just being aware, and I think the biggest thing that I would say is collaboration and collaboration again. Getting the information from other people outside of your circle, what's useful, what will benefit, and really coming from a place of humility will extend and open the doors for wider communities to come in. But that really needs to happen, that collaboration.
Yeah, and just to add on that, and build on this idea of humility, you know, so much greatness has been shared today, but even just the way that you began, Vidyamala, and given permission, that in itself, you know, we can't always assume to know what people's difficulties may be, restrictions, barriers, etc. But when we give permission and we invite a part of ourselves that maybe others aren't really aware of, it gives others permission to do the same. So we can't always have all the answers, but when we can lead by example. We like to say, we're really great at demonstrating that we're not perfect. We're great at doing that. Give others the permission to do that as well. And that's what diversification is about. It's making space for everyone. Sometimes it's useful to be context specific, but sometimes when we're in a space where we don't really know who's in the room, allow people to be who they are, and then they've got somewhere to work from. But yeah, really great question, Parvi. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So I'd like to invite Mel to ask her question, if I may.
Hi, Andrew. Yeah, I think Vidyamala, as you were speaking and you were speaking about pacing, it just sort of sparked a train of thought in me, and that I've spoken to a number of people, particularly over the weekend as lockdown starts to ease. They've had people into the garden, and they're saying what a challenge they found it to go back to some sort of status of normal. People not looking forward to that commute on the busy roads because it's been quiet for so long. And it just seemed that pacing might be a bit prevalent here. And I just wondered whether you'd got any thoughts on this and whether there are any practical tips of coping as people get back to whatever their normal is.
Yeah, that's such a great question, because the assumption, of course, is that, oh, we all can't wait to get back to normal. But for many of us, it's quite threatening. And there is something I've been reading about in the media is re-entry anxiety, which I think is very real for a lot of us. I feel I have it. There's been lots of ways my life has changed last year that I want to hang on to. I don't mean grasp, but I want to continue, and I feel frightened that I'm just going to slide back into all my old ways. So I think, and speaking for myself, I'm just trying to be really, really conscious about it. Maybe that's the main thing, is that we acknowledge, yes, I've got re-entry anxiety, or I'm terrified I'm just going to go back to being this really hectic, busy person I was before. But be really conscious about that, and then make some decisions and set some boundaries. That's certainly what I'm trying to do. Set some boundaries, because I used to travel an enormous amount to lead retreats, and I really, really don't want to do that anymore. So I'm trying to decide, well, I'll do one Buddhist retreat a year and one mindfulness retreat a year, and a personal retreat, that'll be it. And that's really challenging, because when people come to me and say, hey, can you do this, that, and the other in 2022? And I'm going to have to say no. But I'm much less anxious now that I've made it conscious. So that's kind of pacing in terms of diary planning. But I think, pacing in terms of how many people do you want to see in a week, and how far do you want to travel? And in terms of work, a lot of workplaces, I think, are going to be giving us more options about working from home, being clear about that. I'd like to work at home 3 days a week and go to the office 2 days a week, or whatever it might be. So then when your boss comes to you to talk to you, you've worked out, before you have that conversation, you've worked out what you want. And I think that can make an enormous difference. So clarity, I think, is important, and then resolve. That's the hard part. Sticking to whatever it is that you recognize is important.
Or maybe just experimenting a little bit as well.
Yeah, experimenting. Yeah. But apparently re-entry anxiety is a thing. Another thing I've heard is post-pandemic stress disorder, PTSD. Yeah, because it's more change. Suddenly we've got more change. And what we've got now is the assumption, oh, you should be really happy that everything's back to normal. So then there's maybe the guilt if you're thinking, actually, I don't want everything to go back to normal. I think a lot of people don't want everything to go back to whatever normal was.
Thank you. And I think there's something about the variety of responses as well. So different people have different experiences. So from my own experience, I realized the other day that I've seen about 9 people other than in Sainsbury's over the last year. I've only actually seen 9 friends, and I know that that's not as unusual as it may sound. Other people have been going to work, in one guise or another. And obviously I've seen a lot of people on Zoom, but actually physically being in the same space as somebody is weird for me now. And it certainly wasn't before, because I worked in open plan offices for 25 years. So, you know, it's quite an adjustment to then think about seeing lots of people again. And it's, you know, it's great to hear that named, actually. It's sometimes nice to have a name to it. Jenny, did you have any thoughts on that sort of adjustment?
Yes, I think actually, you know, what we mean by the term normal is probably never going to be there again, and people use it in different ways. And one has a sense that the government would love us all to be rushing on the commute again, because that gives money to the transport system and to all the little you know, pret-a-mangers around the corner from the office, and shopping in the lunch times and so on. And actually what I've learned is, if something doesn't come in my grocery delivery, then it's not going to happen, you know, for the last year. And apart from the fact that my son lives abroad, then, you know, I haven't needed to go anywhere that I can't walk within the last year as well. And you know, there's so much that I've enjoyed in that. So sort of going back to the old normal, which we know was destroying the planet, because even in the UK we were living at the rate of 3 planets when we've only got 1. Other countries are even 5 planets. We can't do it, but we, you know, a lot of the things we were told were impossible because that was what we had to have. Turns out to be possible once the pandemic's there. So yeah, I don't think we have to go as far as saying it was wished upon us in order to get us to rethink. But now we've been through this experience, what can we take to our lives? And one of the big positive things that people have spoken about is the community networks that have supported people within the community, the food banks and the deliverers to people who are isolating, and the people who've been on the phone and you know, digging in hedges in their local parks and so on, and people knowing their neighbours, even if it was going outside to clap in the first wave of lockdown, that weren't there before. We don't want to give that up as being something abnormal, but to change into a new way of life that carries all of that with us, with gratitude.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for those of us who are leaders of teams or leaders within organizations, there's a message here about just recognizing people's different lived experience. And some people will be overjoyed at getting back into the office and seeing people, and some people just won't, and it'll be challenging. And it's just having that kindness and appreciation and latitude for people to experience that in their own way. Kindness again, kindness. Chris Owen, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, this is slightly coming at things from a slightly different direction, but it's about where I'm coming at this from is from a mental well-being point of view. So, and particularly I work in the legal profession, where we've just done a very big survey, global survey, which demonstrates that the legal profession is a super stressed environment, and what's more, that in terms of gender, race, age, there's a huge difference between, you know, for example, for ethnic minorities and for women, the mental health issues are much more dramatic than they are for men. And what we've been struggling with is that if you look at law firms, there are very small ones and there are very sophisticated ones. And how can we create a way of either measuring the problem so we can measure the effectiveness of our interventions, or how can we basically create sort of what I'm called maybe a rights approach to some of these issues. So, you know, you've talked about people who are, you know, very nice, kind, caring employers. who want to try and help their employees. But what about in reality, most employers out there are struggling. You know, they've got their profits they need to carry, they have to cope with, and all of those issues. And how are there sort of any principles that you have developed which can, in a sense, I'm not saying force employers, but create a set of sort of guidelines that they can, that employees can say, you know, look, you're not providing me with this very basic support in relation to my long COVID. So if I move away from the mental well-being side to it, to just focusing maybe just on long COVID, is there a, you know, rather like, you know, dignity at work or issues like that? And I noticed that Jenny talked about the Prevention Concord Act and the, you know, the Office of Health Promotion and things. And what I'm just wondering is that, given that most employers are not the most benevolent, but they're not absolute catastrophes either, how can we, in a sense, provide employers with the sort of the guidelines, the principles, the rights approach, rights-based approach to some of these things that will really guide them in how they support their people going through this long COVID, bearing in mind that some are very small, you know, 3 people, and some of these huge international conglomerates. So it's a slightly mixed up issue, and I know I'm conflating mental well-being in the legal profession to an overall review of long COVID, but it seems to me there is stuff there that we could work with.
Who would like to take that first? Jenny?
Come in on that. Yeah, there's 2 things that are really about the self-interest of employers, and then there are 2 sort of legal rights framings I think that could be useful. There's a lot of studies that show that it's sort of cost-benefit analysis of preventing people becoming unwell and helping them back to work early, and that if people actually face a legal challenge over the way they've been treated, that can be extremely costly for a company, particularly if it damages their reputation as well. So I think you'll probably find some of that on, there's a portal about workplace and mental health that's on the, I believe on the Mind website that came out of the Stevenson Farmer report, and that has the business case. It's often not very apparent to an individual employer, because if people don't feel safe to disclose that their real issue is mental health and particularly workplace stress, they may call it something else. So it takes some digging down before the reality of what's there comes in. I think the other thing is what's likely to be the increased power of the particularly young graduates seeking work in an area like the legal profession, that there's more and more information now shared online, as there has been about universities and colleges, about the support that there is for well-being and mental health. It's a very major issue for many young adults, and the internet actually does give ways for people to share their ratings of employers, and that people are in a competition for talent, particularly given the number of people who are now leaving the UK. That's hitting the headlines, that we're having a sort of talent drain of people who were working here. So those are areas of self-interest that employers will want to promote themselves so that they can attract the right people and to retain them. It's very costly business to lose people that you've gone through recruiting and training and then lose them quickly. On the right side, there's 2 important pieces of legislation. One is that the Health and Safety Executive has really got the bit between its teeth on mental health and has seen some extremely poor practice in employers. So they are producing more and more guidance on the issue and bringing it into their inspections. It's not just whether people are going to trip over a cable, but whether they're going to stay well when they're in a workplace, and if they're getting reports of very poor management practices, like the extremely long hours that some big city finance companies or legal companies come up with, and that's not good for them. And the other is the Equality Act, which is really underused for mental health. People have actually fought quite a long time not to describe mental ill health as a disability, but in terms of the Act, actually, if you have recurrent mental health problems, it does qualify as a disability, that you can be discriminated against, and that employers actually have that they have the duty, what's called an anticipatory duty. So they don't just have to be asked to do something, they have to anticipate that they might be asked, and to invite people to say if they need special consideration because they may have a recurrent mental health problem. I've worked with a charity where the leader has won case after case against everybody under the sun, because virtually nobody actually asks, might you need special help for reason of, anxiety or depression or a mental health issue. So that the law is more on the side of people who may experience mental ill health than we've realised so far. And in the legal profession, I'm sure they're very keen not to be seen to be breaking the law.
And on that very positive note, unfortunately, we have run out of time. That hour and a half has gone unbelievably quickly, as we suspected it might. If it's possible, we might ask if we can drag you back for another session, because I feel that there's so much more. Perhaps we could discuss this again in 6 months or 12 months time, when more is known about what the consequences are, and we all have more insight from our own experience, both as teachers and champions. But in the meantime, just thank you so much, Vidyamala and Jenny, for a wonderful, wonderful session. Thank you so much for your time and being with us tonight.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having us. Yeah.
Lovely to see you all.
Yeah.
Keep up the fantastic work you're all doing.
Yeah, really wonderful.
Thank you.
Oh, lovely messages.
It's lovely to see you. Thank you for coming along.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming along.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Vidyamala. Thank you, Jenny. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Lots to share at work in the finance industry. all these stressed people, long hours. So yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Jenny, Vidyamala, Andrew, Teresa, and everyone.
Take care. Lovely to see you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey, Teresa, bye.
Bye. Lovely to see you. Take care.
Yes.